Eric, what's going on, man? Welcome to the Dad Edge, my friend.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Oh, same here, my man. Same here. So we are talking about smart kids, right? How to raise smart kids. First question I have for you is, what exactly is a smart kid? And as you think about that, I just want to kind of give you some context of why I asked that question because I think it's a very loaded question. So I grew up, my generation. And I don't think you were too far behind me. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I graduated high school in the 90s. And you were only as smart as what the report card said you were. And if you didn't fit into that box, you were a complete idiot, right? Like that's kind of like the way you were. Like, oh, you're not smart. And as I got older, I didn't do very well in school. I actually failed the eighth grade. I had to do eighth grade twice, but I was an average student. And then my junior and senior year of high school, I made the honor roll, and then all through college, I made A's and B's. So I basically when it came to school, I actually just had to learn how I learned when it came to that, and it was very interesting. Like I realized that my attention span was very short. So if I watched the instructor or watched the teacher, I got lost a lot. And I literally I learned that I was pretty much an audio listener. And if I kept like my hand over my head like this, the teachers probably thought I wasn't interested, but I actually was. If I could hear their words and I took notes on what they were saying, if I heard it and I reflected, I wrote it and I saw it, I could remember it. It was really, really fascinating. And I was just like, wow, I could actually learn way better this way. But I remember those stereotypes of like you are not smart unless you have these good grades, right? But here I am, and I'll just use this as an example. I went to high school, especially like one of the guys I was in high school with, straight A student, he was captain of the baseball team, he was quarterback for the football team, and he played basketball. Got a full ride to Notre Dame, and played sports there. Full ride to Notre Dame. Well, if you look at him on paper and me on paper, I probably should have been working for him for his own company. And what happened is he ended up being an employee of mine, a sales rep of mine, and I was his boss for 7 years.
Hmm.
And I thought that was kind of fascinating because on paper, like that should have never have happened. Like he had a quote unquote Ivy League college education. I had just a state university education. All these things that he had did, like everybody would say, oh, he's way smarter. But I always tell my kids, I'm like, your grades in school will not dictate, number one, how smart you are. It will measure how well you can learn information, maybe retain it or whatever. But it's not necessarily a measure of like how smart you are or your common sense or how you make decisions or how successful you're going to be in life. So I know that's a loaded question. So I'm so curious to hear your answer to that because like I think, quite frankly, I think we get that wrong because when we think about smarts, we automatically think about school. And when we think about school, we automatically think about grades. And when we think about grades, we're thinking about class ranking and all this other stuff. But I'm curious of what your answer is on that one.
Great question. So, I guess the first thing is that, look, we put smart in the title because it will hopefully draws people attention and people like
Sure.
the idea of having a smart kid. It makes you feel proud you have a smart
Right.
kid, right? Okay, so that's a bit of marketing. But in a way, if when you actually look at the book, I think what you'll find is that the the book is really about, to some degree, or we talk about how kids need to find things in life that really interest them. Because, once you get past going in high school and going in college and people telling you, you're going to write about this or you're going to learn this or this is what you should know, then you have to go out into the real world and actually find things that interest you. So you run a podcast because you like talking to people and you have ideas and you're interested in what people have to say and you have ideas about who to interview, right? So if you just come out of college knowing how to write a five, paragraph essay and you don't have interests and creativity, then yes, you may not do as well. And I think so I think developing those passions is absolutely critical. And I think the other thing is that parents can get hung up to their detriment on comparing, right? So in other words, oh my goodness, my neighbor's kids are going to an Ivy League and my child isn't. And that's embarrassing. And I totally am sympathetic to it. But the more that you start to engage as a parent in that type of thinking, I think the more stressed you're going to be and the more detrimental it is to your kid. No matter that, there's the richest person in the world, I think is now in Elon Musk, okay? Elon Musk. And he's one out of, I don't know how many billion people in the world, 7 billion, right? And then there's the best athletes in the world. There's virtually no chance that your child is going to do that. So if you want your child to be the best, they're always going to fall short, right? Like they can be the best basketball player in their high school, but then they go to college. And if they're the best player in their college, maybe they'll go to the NBA. But there's always going to be somebody who is, more successful than you are. So if you focus on the glass being half empty and that type of comparison, I think that's a mistake. But the last thing I'll say about being smart and about the book is this. So there's the question of what you want for your kids intellectually, and there's also just the very practical issues, right? So we do know, for example, that a lot of things that you want to accomplish in life are going to be easier if you have somewhat better SAT scores, right? It's not necessarily determinative, right? But everything being else being equal. And so one of the things we try to focus on in the book is to say, look, you can do well in these classic academic pursuits. You can teach your kids to do well without having them study endlessly for the SATs or study all the time. And there's a surprising number of things that can help them be conventionally academically successful, which does matter in our society. So,
and why do you think it matters so much? Do you think that I'll give you an example. I used to work in surgical device sales, so I did that for 18 years. So I was in the OR for 18 years, and fascinating thing about working with just anybody in any trade, like anything, whether you're a mechanic, whether you're a carpenter, whether you're an electrician, computer programmer, whatever. Those book smarts don't necessarily equal, the grassroots of what you do, right? The actual execution of what you do. So I've seen many surgeons who graduated summa cum laude from medical school, but they're terrible with their hands.
right.
Like they're clunky, they're uncertain, they're not confident, they make mistakes. And it's no different than anything, right? Like, so you have a guy who goes to a trade school for automotive, right? But he's not a great mechanic. My father-in-law has been the foreman of the shop that he works for the county for 30 years. And he'll tell you, he's like, just because a guy does really great in trade school, that doesn't mean he's going to be a great mechanic. And
Right.
just because, and we see that in other areas. So I guess the question I have for you is, I understand the breadcrumbs of, SAT scores and ACT scores and grades. And perhaps this is someone who's really, really driven and, on paper, they're smart. But why do we put as a society so much clout on that, do you think?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, look, it also depends upon where you are. So, for example, I'm in New York. Happen to be in New York City, right? You know what I'm saying? And the truth is, it's probably a little bit different in New York City than in other places because we don't have too many manufacturing plants right here, right? And so many of the jobs. I mean, although we have plumbing jobs and other jobs which you can certainly or construction managers and many types of things like that. But there is somewhat of a focus on college. But I agree with you. I think that many people are ill served by getting education that frankly isn't that practical, right? And which they have too much debt. So I do agree with you.
Yeah. And I wasn't, yeah, I come at these questions with you just to
Hmm.
be quite honest, just absolute curiosity.
Hmm.
Like to really, really unpack and understand, why is that the way it is? But I mean, I understand where you're coming from. but I've never been able to speak to somebody who is in your space to be able to ask these questions, and I've always wanted to. So I
Right.
appreciate you taking the time to ask
Sure.
those. As it relates to your book, though, one of the things that I do want to talk to you about is investing in our kids' relationship. And why that's a long term play. As we look at our kids as they're in their younger years, right? They're so dependent on us, right? When they're early on. It probably isn't until they were a tween or a teen, they start to gain that independence and start to break free from us a little bit. But we're it's a constant pouring into them, right? And at some point you have these moments, I think, where you feel that that's, I don't want to use the term given back, but it's more reciprocity. It's more give and take in the relationship. And I'm starting to see that in my relationship now that my oldest is 17 and his younger brother is 15. And then I've got 9 and 7, but I've seen those investments pay off now. And
Mhm.
it's so rewarding. Like I've said this for a while now, but if anyone ever tells you that, oh, just wait till they're teenagers, they
Mhm.
won't want a thing to do with you.
Mhm.
You're never gonna see them. They're gonna roll your eyes every time that you talk to them, that kind of thing. I always tell people just run in the other direction, because if we do the right things, I think early on in the relationship, the good things will happen long term. But it's a difficult thing to do, when we're constantly giving. It's not that we don't want to, but we don't see that sort of give and take in the relationship until later on.
Yeah, no, and certainly that's true. And I have three children. Two of them in college. One is now graduated, is 25 years old, and the 25-year-old, my oldest son Culver, to this day, we play tennis pretty regularly. We play pool on this pool
I
table
see that.
back
Yeah.
here. We have a ping pong cover. We play ping pong. We play in bridge tournaments, right? That's one of the, we were big, game playing families. Um, I taught my children chess. Two of them, because they went to my wife's schools, also learned a lot of chess. I am now the worst chess player of the four of
Oh,
them, right?
really?
Uh, my daughter is a little bit better than me, and my middle son, my oldest son, somewhat better. My middle one just, is embarrassingly better than me. And I think that, look, when I remember when I'm young, you get out in the tennis court, you feed your kids balls, or you play chess, and the kid, can't really play that well. But even by the time my son was, say, 11, it was more fun to hit the ball around with him. He could hit the ball with me. But there is this point, I think, where as a parent, it gets so, you're just putting so much into it. They don't behave. And frankly, I think for a lot of parents, you can just feel it's just, and it's just not as fun. And I think that, I guess it's dangerous to stereotype, but I think like women often naturally have much more of a sense of like, oh, the kid is so cute. They have this maternal instinct. I think some parents, certainly was my case, some fathers, that wasn't quite, as present for me. But I did, as I spent more time with them, I got a huge amount back, over time. And, to some extent, you're hopefully making kids happy and and productive citizens, but you're also in some ways investing in somebody who kind of is your model for a person you'd want to spend time with, right? And so hopefully it ends up there. I do think one of the things that, that phenomena you're talking about, which I don't understand because all three of our kids love to spend time with us. Our daughter, who's the youngest, talks to my wife probably every day or two from college.
So cool.
And, so very close. And I do think one of the things that's tough for parents, is there's can be just a lot of negativity. And I think people justify it in their minds by they say, oh, I'm teaching the kid to be responsible. So I'm telling them, why don't you clean up your room? Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? I think that because people are weak in our natures and we're frustrated, we often take that frustration out on our kids, right? and we justify it as saying, "Oh, we're parenting, we're teaching them how to be responsible." And if you just shower your kids with negativity, they're not going to want to spend time with you. I'm sorry, you know. And so that just, and it's tough, but I think that, like when you're, like, imagine you're dating somebody, right? You know, and you want the person to love you, right? Because you're interested in them, right? Well, you probably are going to make an effort to be likable. You're going to make jokes. You're going to compliment them. You're going to do all these things. Now you could say, well, that's being unnatural, right? I don't think so. You're you're being natural, right? But you also want to develop a relationship. Well, I think the same thing is true with your kids, right? You 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 can't just sort of act, quote, naturally however you feel. You feel like if you're in a shitty mood, I'm in a shitty mood, I'm going to criticize you. You have to be positive. And if you're negative, you're going to reap, unhappiness. And if you're positive, you're going to reap happiness. That's my opinion.
I like that. I agree with that. I, I think if we harp on our kids, I, I think if we harp on our kids with a ton of negativity, it creates a distance in the relationship. I've seen this with, it's kind of like, I think a lot of kids, and I think of, and I want to be, I want to be careful here because my wife has a relationship with someone in her family, and I'll leave it at that she's very choosy about, like, do I go talk to this person about this? Because I know that I'm going to get this response back. Right. So, like, I'm very cautious about what I do versus I think, we can create a bond with our kids and a relationship with our kids that's more like, I have this going on, whether it's good or bad, and I'm gonna go to mom or dad about this. And not that we're always going to be that person, but I think we can be one of those people that our kids go to. At the same time, I do think it's important, though, to be to over communicate with our kids, and I want to get your view on that. So, like, for instance, there are times where my kids aren't pulling their weight, and I need to share, I need to communicate with them on what needs to happen. Now, the way that I go about that is like, why can't you do this? What's wrong with you? Type thing. Saying, like, versus like, hey, we made an agreement, right, as a family, that we keep our environment, tidy, and you were a part of that agreement. So I'm looking at your room, and the story I'm telling myself is you've probably been really, really busy. You've got a lot of things going on, and we still need to do exactly what we agreed upon doing, which is clean our room. So how might we go about doing that?
Yep.
So just the approach is a bit different, right? But it's still also like, I'm holding you accountable to what we agreed upon at the same time, right? I'm not coddling you, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think is important too. And I think another thing too, which I think creates a different environment. I want to get your take on this, and it's something that I used to face plan on over and over and over and over again. And that is, if I was having a bad moment, or I was having a challenging day, or something was on my mind that felt heavy or burdensome or whatever, what men usually do is we internalize that. Mm-hmm. And we actually try to hide it. Mm-hmm. But usually what happens is, for most of us, is the people that we love most and love us most can see that a mile away, whether we try to hide it or not, So, and when they come up to us and they're like, hey, what's wrong? Are you okay? Did you have a bad day? Nope, I'm good. I'm fine. Uh-huh. And it's almost like we put up this shield because we're like, I don't want you to see that I'm having a moment here, which I think in a way sometimes is appropriate. Mm-hmm. Other times I think it's really detrimental. And one thing I've noticed in my own relationships is that if I am that way towards my kids because of something I'm going through, then, and quite frankly, it has nothing to do with them. It might be a work-related issue. It might be something in my mindset, whatever. But it has nothing to do with them. But the way that they're going to interpret that energy is, what did I do wrong?
Yep.
Did I do something wrong? Why, if it's not me, then why can't he tell me?
Yep.
And one thing I've noticed is just communicating, like just saying, hey, I just want to let you know, I had a really challenging day today. Yep. Like today I got served a couple slices of humble pie, and I'm just trying to really just deal with it mentally. And if I seem distant or if I seem cold, just know it has nothing to do with you whatsoever. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to think through some things, and probably the way I'm coming across to you might be cold.
Mm.
But just simply communicating those things, because in the times that we're not like Mr. Positivity, right, or we don't create that atmosphere of like, we're good here. What do you think that approach does for kids and psychology and even the relationship?
No, I think that's a great point. And by the way, what happens in my family, again, particularly with my eldest son, is I can be frustrated at times, and also I'm a lawyer, so I'm a litigator, so by profession, so I tend to get very uh, go into sort of cross-examination mode sometimes,
Yeah.
and so or just be pissy or critical or things like that. And my son will call me out. He probably says like every like week or two, he'll be like, "Dad, seems like you're being a little snippy there," and I'm like 90% of the time, I'm like, yeah, you're right. Okay, I confess, I'm pissed off about this thing. So that can, if the kids can also, yeah, understand that, and if you can admit that, I think that you're imperfect. I think yes, I think that will go a long way.
Yeah. It's interesting. You say that I'm a litigator, and cross examination mode. My brother is an attorney,
Hmm.
and my brother he's believe it or not, even though I make a living on this microphone, I'm actually an introvert.
Uh-huh.
I'm actually very introverted, and I do like people. I love talking to people. At the same time, it does take quite a bit of energy for me. And my brother is the same way. He's a little bit actually more quiet and reserved, but he's absolutely like, so he grew up playing hockey. He was a national team for the junior blues. Like he is an absolute fierce player, like
Hmm.
super competitive. And in the courtroom and with his clients, it's like Jekyll and Hyde. It's like he's calm, cool, collected, and then in the courtroom, boom, he can turn it on. And I imagine, I think a lot of you guys seem to be kind of wired that way, huh?
Yeah, no, that is true. And it's also very true of actors. You'll hear stories of actors who are immensely shy, but then when they get on stage, they can be, uh, you know, appear to be an extrovert, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. So, but yeah, I want to also talk about, I want to go into the characteristics of a smart kid
Hmm.
beyond just book smarts, right? I know before we hit record here, one of the examples that you used was actually the ability to make decisions,
Hmm.
right? Along with a whole host of probably other things. But beyond schoolwork, what are the characteristics that a smart kid, or if we're trying to develop an intellectually advanced kid, what does that look like?
Well, so one of the biggest things is simply concentration, and one of the things we found as parents, but also my wife runs these very successful charter schools, educates 20,000 students, and the students are do phenomenally well. And two out of our three children went to her schools. One of the things that she instituted at her schools was chess instruction. So every single one of these 20,000 children gets chess instruction when they are young and plays it a certain amount. And how far they take it depends. At a certain point, it becomes optional, and they can choose to do it. But she has like for the New York State Championships, like half the students at the championships are from her schools, from the whole state. Okay. Um, and
It's
the reason
impressive.
why it's such a focus is that it requires concentration to
Yeah.
play the game well for long periods of time. And that, and it requires patience. And so our middle son, who went in, I believe it was the third grade, to the state championships, um, which took place sorry, the national championships, which took place in Nashville. And that doesn't mean, by the way, he was not an absolutely top player at that point. You have different levels, right? But the interesting thing about it, he was sort of a medium level player. But the interesting thing about it was that um, he did do quite well in his division, was one of the top people. And it was because he could concentrate for long periods of time. So each game could essentially last to about 4 hours. And on the last day, because he made it to like the, the finals, they played 3 games. So you could have up to 12 hours of chess per day.
Wow.
And the chess is just as intense as taking the SAT. So imagine taking like maybe 4 SATs in a row, and that basically is the equivalent of what you do in this chess tournament. But he was completely oblivious. I wasn't there, but my wife was there. And when he was done playing his last tournament, he turned to her. He says, "Is it dinner time yet?" And at that point, it was like 10:30. Okay, and so the point is that a lot of things require just concentration, and unfortunately, particularly in this day and age, with all of the kind of YouTubes and video games, concentration is in short supply, right? So if I see a kid, for example, who is working on a wood project or painting his toy soldiers or building a treehouse, right? Or any type of activity where they're paying attention and they want to get it right. They're measuring twice and cutting once, as they say in the business of of craftsmanship. That's the type of thing that is so critical. And so smart, smart is a book term that's on the cover of the book to sell books, right? But the truth is that the real qualities are interest and focus and patience, right? And if you have those things, that's actually probably a lot more, and you can help your kids develop those things in various ways by like, you know, playing board games with them or listening to stories together.
I can see that. I've always heard, so chess, I mean, it requires a ton of concentration and also really strategic thinking, right? You have to be thinking about not just the move I'm making, but what are the moves that are going to be made after I make this move,
Yeah.
correct? So,
Yeah.
yeah, it requires that incredible strategic thinking. And yeah, I do, you bring up a really good point here that I didn't think we would maybe talk about, but I would love to get your 2 cents on it, whether you have any data to back this up or just an opinion. It doesn't really matter, or anything in between. But I think we are absolutely dealing with an epidemic here with these like short reels. And I think I read here recently that the average like attention span right now is 1.3 seconds before a kid who's just been scrolling like on TikTok or YouTube, all these short reels, like you have 1.3 seconds to get their attention onto whatever it is that we're trying to do. And after that, they're just sort of gone because it's like TikTok and these short reels are training these kids to just keep swiping and keep swiping into just an endless black hole.
No,
But what is that doing to us? What is it doing to the
well, yeah,
brain?
I mean, I don't have, there has been research done. I don't have it at the top of my fingertips, but I have no doubt that it's happening because you can just see it all around you where these kids can't, pay attention and they have to grab their iPhone, in a minute. And look, I think even I am subject to that. I think my attention span has been challenged. And just to give you an idea of how insidious this is, so just take like a movies, right? So in movies, okay, the number of cuts per minute has more than doubled
Wow.
today versus say the 1940s, right? So in the 1940s, when you had these great films like Western films, which kids loved seeing, kids didn't say, "Oh my goodness, those Westerns are boring." They loved them, right? But nowadays, you kids find a little boring because you have like the opening of Shane, which is one of these great westerns that my dad
Oh
loved,
yeah.
and
I remember that.
and he's going through these beautiful plains, and you wonder who he is and why he's going there. And in an old-fashioned film, there was time to think, right? You think about like the game of baseball, like why. is baseball fun? Well, baseball is fun partly because you get time to think. You say it's a 3-1 count. I wonder, is he gonna throw a fastball, and is he gonna swing at the pitch? Right? You have time to think what's gonna happen, and that's part of the excitement, right? Similarly, in a good film, right, old film, you'd see that a couple was flirting a little bit, and you think to yourself, oh, I wonder if she's as interested in him, and oh, I wonder who really was the real murderer, and there's all of that, and so the the longer shots and the pauses are opportunities for you to think actively yourself and bring something to it. But nowadays, the films are so fast that they kind of make it very difficult to actually think about, right?
True. Yeah.
And I think that's such a problem. Like even in films, right?
That's a really good point. Um, you know, as it relates to, attention,
Right.
what is a parent to do when it comes to concentration? Like, what can we do on the home front that actually helps that?
Right. Well, I think the first thing you need to do is simply and look, I want to stress there's a lot of really positive things you can do, okay? Like, for example, just play a game of Monopoly with your kids or whatever you like. Build a tree house with them, right? Um, uh, there's any number of activities, and the main feature of those activities is they have to not involve social media or YouTube, okay? Outside of that, there's a broad range of activities in which your children can engage. Um, when you tell them you're not going to watch your TV, you're not going to use YouTube, you're not going to play that video game, they will assure you that everything else in the world is impossibly boring and that you just don't understand. Even though somehow children survived, for millennia before the invention of the iPhone in 2008 and YouTube, but it's their addiction that they just can't imagine a world in which you can have fun doing these other things. So unfortunately, the one thing you do have to do is just you have to shut that sucker down, right? Because if you don't do that, it just becomes so much harder to do everything else. Once you get past that, you know, kids, like one of the things we did in our family was to listen to audiobooks, right? And I think you mentioned this, that you were more of an audio listener, right? So my
100%.
daughter, my youngest daughter, had a case of dyslexia, which is basically a difficulty learning to read, which usually has to do with visual things. So, and I had it too. I wrote my name backwards, right?
Wow.
90, so my it was like I was mirror writing. My E would be backwards, my R would be backwards, right?
Interesting.
And so I didn't read a lick till essentially the beginning of second grade. So I read, maybe like a year and a half late. At that point, once I kind of got past that, I very quickly caught up within like, I don't know, 6 months, right? And then I was, but here's the point. My daughter was a little more delayed. And so one of the things we found is we encouraged her to listen to books. Now you might say, well, gee, listening to books, right? That has nothing to do with literacy. Literacy is about reading. Well, when we think of that, which is professionals call decoding, which is turning letters, written letters into words, that's a gateway skill, which is absolutely important. But for 99% of people, it quickly becomes irrelevant, right? Who's a good eighth grade reader, or ninth grade reader, 10th grade reader, or a college reader? It's not like the one person is better at turning written letters into words. What makes you a better reader is that you have a bigger vocabulary, that you can understand complex sentences, right? That you can understand complex ideas, the relationship of ideas. All of that you can develop by listening, right? So one of the things we would do is on a car trip or in other places, we would listen to to short stories, particularly together. That also, so that can be a great experience, right? And obviously, just like reading to your kids, watching family films together, right? That are from 1940 and don't have 9 clips per second, and the kill count of some of these modern films, right?
Yeah, some of them, like I really couldn't put my finger on it, but like when I'd go to the movies and I'd see movies with my kids, I'm like, God bless. I was like, this, I feel like I'm in Vegas, where you walk through the casinos and it's like stimulation overload with all the lights and the sounds and everything. You're like, and just taking it all in with your senses. It's pretty overwhelming. Versus like how you and I probably grew up, which is a little bit different as far as like how we watched movies and what was available as far as the technology went. Let me ask you this: when it comes to helping our kids focus, and I know you brought up a few things here, but I would say more acutely, like in the moment. I think a lot of us, what we'll do is we'll be like, "Hey, focus," or "Hey, pay attention," or "Hey, like concentrate on what you're doing." And I don't know those types of if that type of direction is effective. Is it effective?
Probably not.
Okay.
I think that the best way to get your children to focus is to have them do something which intrigues them, where they care about the result. And that's why we're so big on the games, right? So, because the thing is, kids like to win, particularly young kids, right? But people like to win, right? So when that's why, like whether it's chess or Monopoly or checkers or all these games, right? Kids will focus not to please you because they want to win, right? So if you can harness that desire, right? If you can find anything that your kids like, right? I think that's going to be much more effective than telling them to focus.
That makes a lot of sense. Uh, because we're leaving out the how. I think it's really interesting when we gamify just about anything. Um, there is so one of the guys that does life with us in our mastermind, and I'm going to butcher the app that he was talking about, which is he's actually on my team. He's one of our coaches. I think it's called Habatica, I think it is. But it's basically gamifying your habits. And instead of focusing on like, and the reason that he did this was because he's suffering from long COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So he's one of these rare guys who got COVID. He's young, very healthy, but he got COVID. And over the past 12 months, it's really knocked him for a loop. Like
Mm-hmm.
he's noticed his energy, his brain fog.
Mm-hmm.
It's really impacted some of the things that he does. He's a big avid exerciser. He's found that he can't exercise quite like he used to yet, and it's really wearing on him. Right? He's like, I really downloaded this app because I want to gamify, some of the habits, and really wanted to decide on a day-to-day basis, okay, on this particular day, I'm way too exhausted. Like my body isn't going to allow me to go into the gym and do a really hard workout. But
Mm-hmm.
what I can do is I can walk,
Mm-hmm.
right? I can go for a walk for a mile or two with the dog, and to gamify these habits. And then what happens is when he gamifies it, you get like these little dopamine hits. And he told me, he's like, I've reached the level of domination rogue. And I'm like, what does that mean? And he's like, oh, you need to rack up so many of these points in order to hit that, that level. And he's like, there's more levels ahead of me, there's more levels below me, but I had to get to that level. And I've been like really trying to get to that level. So I'm really focusing on the things I can do. But you really hit an interesting point here, which is gamifying something or creating a challenge in such a way where the kids want to go out and win. Have you found that there's a way to do that when it comes to schoolwork?
Well, so here's the thing, though. I'm going to push back on the assumption in your question, which is that, look, I just think that schoolwork is way overrated, right? So there's first, not kids don't really get all that much homework nowadays anyway, which is maybe arguably a problem, right? And I really think that parents should focus less on thinking about ways that they can get their kids to do schoolwork better. I mean, you want to tell them a little bit to do that, and really about thinking about making all of that other time educational, totally independently of school. Like I think parents are like, oh, to do better in school, the kid has to somehow do his homework better and all those types of things. Yes, but there's just so many other things. Kids, we think of school as being this hugely important intellectual development. And we downplay all the stuff that happens outside of school. So let me give you an example. When kids show up at school, fifth in 5 years old, the average kid already has a vocabulary of 10,000 words, and they learn 10 words a day. Now, I don't see too many parents running around assigning their kids vocabulary lists of 10 words a day. But kids learn it. How do they learn it? Because they listen, right? They pick up words with this astonishing speed. And they don't pick up words by watching TikTok, right? Or playing video games. They pick up words by watching good films. Like if you listen, or just for example, watch these documentaries by Attenborough, right? Not only are they beautiful, right? But his language is just phenomenal. It's quite impressive. So watch those with your kids. Then maybe talk about them. What did you find interesting about that? That's something my wife and I would often do on Saturday and Sunday afternoon. We'd watch them with our kids, and then we'd have dinner. Everyone says, oh, you should have a dinner conversation with your kids, but it's often very difficult because, again, there's this problem that we talked about earlier that it feels like you're giving and you're not getting anything back. So it becomes very one way because they don't bring information. But if you watch a film, we found that even when our kids were fairly young, like 8, 9, 10, that they actually could pick up often just as much as we could from the film. So we could have a really interesting conversation, right? Kids spend astonishingly little time in school and particularly learning in school. So first, kids go to school for 180 days. That's less than half of 365. When they do go to school, okay, they only spend half of their waking hours that day, about 8 out of 16, okay? Then there's time off for lunch, recess, changing classes, wasted time, field trips, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you really look at it, maybe half of their time in school is actually at a good school is probably what we would think of as traditional learning, reading, math, all this kind of stuff. So basically what that means is that kids spend about 10% of their waking hours over the course of a year learning English and math, right? Because it's half the days, it's half the hours during a day, that brings you down a quarter. And then even during that school day, which is only a quarter of their time, only half of that. So that brings you to an eighth, right? So my point is that people are like, well, why do some kids from different families learn so why do some of them lag so much more than others? And the answer is because you learn so little of your waking hours of a child are spent learning in school. So when you realize that, then you realize that something like time you're going to spend on the evening or the weekend watching a film, talking, playing a game, those can have a much bigger impact precisely because those hours of formal education are so few. Does that, make sense? Like one other example would be my kids love the musical Hamilton so much that all three of them, particularly my oldest, my son, and my daughter, who's very into music, they knew most of the lyrics, maybe all of the lyrics. I think all the lyrics of the songs in Hamilton by heart.
Wow.
And they just they listened to it over and over again. And those lyrics are just incredibly sophisticated. There's lots of wordplay. There's lots of sophisticated vocabulary. When Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote it, he said afterwards, his plan was that he knew nobody was going to be able to understand all of it and all of the inside jokes by listening to it once. You have
Mm.
to listen to it multiple times even to get, you know, most of his points. So, any of it. So my point is, I wouldn't focus so much at, you know, I would focus less on the schoolwork and more on getting kids excited about anything, right? Does that make any sense?
Like getting them excited about learning. Is that what you're
Getting
saying?
excited about
Yeah.
language, right?
Like, yeah.
About music, right? Um, like my mother had a fantastic collection of music. And Lin Manuel Miranda also had this, by the way. His parents loved show tunes, so he was listening to all these albums, right? Uh, my mother had a fair number of songs of like folk artists, like Cat Stevens, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and the interesting thing about it is that kids don't like to listen to poetry because poetry they often find boring. But good music, I mean, and there's different types of good, but I'm talking about music with lyrics, that are sort of interesting where there's a focus, right? They're like poetry. So for example, there's a great one, there's a great song by Bob Dylan. I may mess up the lyrics, but at a certain point he says, "How many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry?" And the point is that he's trying to make is that we're often seemingly indifferent to people suffering, right? But to a child who first hears that lyric, he's like, "Well, I don't get it. Like, you'd have to have more than the usual number of ears. Would that help? Would having 3 or 4 ears help?" Right? And so you hear these lyrics and you think about them, right? And the great thing about music is that kids will listen to music over and over again. They won't listen to poetry over again. They'll listen to music, and it can have a real impact on their intellect to do that.
That's really interesting. Um, what about this? When it comes to other things that we could do, like, is there, so like for instance, is speaking of music, is there a positive impact on kids listening to music while they study or while they do work? Because we're seeing, like, now, especially with this generation, kids always have AirPods in, and my kids, my 15-year-old, his grades are fine. He does pretty well in school, but he always studies with music in. And is there a correlation between kids being able to retain information, study more effectively? And I'm not talking about rap or like headbanging music or anything like that, but is there a correlation between listening to music and the brain just being more of a sponge? I don't know.
I mean, look, music can be it's like dancing to music. Apparently, I think like the author Stephen King, I read he likes playing like very energetic, you know, music, right? Because it kind of keeps him going, right?
Right.
So I think it probably is fine. I mean, the thing I worry more is I mean, look, so much of homework is so mundane, right? That's a whole other problem. Kids. Part of the problem is that, and I guess I'll get back to, maybe I'll try to answer your question a little bit more because I kind of rejected the premise of your question earlier about homework. I'm sorry. Can you still hear me?
That's okay.
Okay, I touched my.
Yeah. Yep.
So I rejected the premise of your question about helping with schoolwork. The one thing I would say is this: most kids take an incredibly passive approach to their education, and it's very much encouraged by the teachers because the teachers assign you this homework, right? And they say, do these 19 math problems, right? And often, you don't necessarily need to do 19 math problems. You kind of, but you need to really understand it, right? So you'll have kids and they'll do the homework. And let's say, for example, when they're getting to the test, they don't go through and look at the homework and see where they got the answers wrong, right? Well, that's the most obvious thing to do, right? Go back, look at what you got wrong so you can get it right, you know? And then, the other thing is that, you need to, um, so one of the skills I learned. So let me give you a totally practical kind of, this is good for your kids and it'll help them do better without too much work. In my senior year of high school, I had a teacher who taught me essentially just to outline anything I was reading, and any sort of nonfiction book. Okay, it was in a psychology class, and essentially what you just take is you take the information and you say, if it's about, let's say it's a biography of George Washington, right? You have a section on, Revolutionary War, appointed, to command the troops in such and such a date, famous battles, you write them underneath, right? You know, that process of taking stuff and outlining it, um, helps you organize it in your head intellectually. What a lot of kids will do is they either just read, right, which is, you know, not terribly good, or what's often they'll do is sometimes underline, right? The main advantage of underlining is that it's easy, right? But when I was in law school, I did this all the way through law school, and when I was in law school, um, I just created outlines. I'd read the cases and then I'd supplement them based upon one, and it didn't take a huge amount of time. I never studied past like 8 p.m. In law school. Pretty much, I'd go to dinner and stuff like that. The night before finals, I didn't stay up late. Usually went to see a film because that kind of relaxed me. Um, but once I had that outline, I just went back and reviewed the outline, and I built up a structure. So if you can get your kids to do that, and to take responsibility as opposed to just doing the homework, right? They say, what do I need to do to get a 95 on this test? It can be done surprisingly easy. Like, you know.
Tell me more.
Well, I mean, look, it's just that, um, what you're doing is you're actively identifying what are the facts, right? You're putting it to your own structure, which is like a structure in your brain. I don't know if you've heard that, when people would memorize long lists, right? They have, what they'll often do, like these professional people, is they have this like story they'll create in their own mind. And then they'll like associate all these things with the story. I'm not really an expert in this, but it's this technique. And essentially, our brains are much better off when we organize, right, things in our head, right? So if you go through the process of organizing it and just putting like simple words, right? Like for a law school course, I usually could reduce the course to like, I don't know, 20 pages of outlines. And keep in mind, it's not, half of these are just like a few words, right? So so it's like 20 pages. It's not that big, right? And you realize there's really not that much there, right? Um, so, but it's about being more active and about creating your own, you know, uh, structure in your head, if that makes sense. You know?
No, that makes a lot of sense. Really interesting. Yeah, I'll take this one step forward. When I was going through college, I was really trying to understand like how can I retain information for finals, because I was always one of those people that did fine in class, did fine on classwork. When it came time to testing, I wasn't the best, and it's because like it was just the information was so broad. Especially like I was okay actually on tests. It was midterms and finals
Yep.
that I had the biggest issue with. I found, and this sounds absolutely monotonous and tedious, and I didn't even know what I was doing at the time when I did it. but this is going back a few years when I was in college. And what I used to do is I used to take my Braveheart soundtrack, the CD, I put it in the CD player that I had. I would light a candle as well because there was something about the music and the sense of smell. I don't know what it was, but it just created an environment where I wanted to do what I was doing.
Hmm. Yep.
And then what I would do is I would make flashcards with
Yep.
my notes. And I would just simply write a question and then a one, two, or no more than 3 word answer on the back to just jog my memory enough to get me that answer. Well, when it came time to take the test, what I noticed was is when I would see a question on the test, I could like literally visually remember seeing what was on the back of that card,
Hmm.
like the handwriting it was, the words that were used, and it was able for me to recall that information so much easier. So I think that I don't know if that's in line with what you're talking about, where you're taking information, you're just condensing it down towards a bit more bite size. But I found in that environment, doing that type of exercise allowed me to retain the information and then be able not only retain it, but then to basically regurgitate it when I needed it, if that makes sense.
Totally. And I think the important thing is that it's more effective if you make the flashcards than if somebody hands them to you.
Oh
Because
my gosh, that was, yeah, that's a game changer.
right,
Yeah.
because the thing is, what it means is that you've created that link, right? You've thought of it, and it's that active approach, right? And so it just, it really, uh, kids are terribly inefficient, and what worries me more is when you have kids, for example, that do homework while watching television, which happens, right? They'll have friends on, they'll be doing it. That's bad because obviously, I think it's one thing to have Braveheart on. I think you know, that's great. I listen to Braveheart too. I like that song, that music. It's wonderful.
Same.
Feel, but it's another thing where you're really dividing your attention between that and say watching an episode of Friends, which,
Right.
you know, that becomes problematic. You know,
Rest in peace, Matthew Perry.
yeah, right, yes, right.
Hey, this has been really enlightening, Eric. I want to make sure as we wrap up here, resources that you might have that you can share with the audience if you can make
Well,
anyone's life easier. And then also where to find your books.
yeah.
I know the
So I
book
mean,
just
you
came out in October.
find it in bookstores everywhere, but on Amazon. But look, one of the things that we really tried to do in this book, and I should mention, by the way, that we're giving our proceeds to my wife's school. So this is not. This is really a mission of love for my wife and I, because we really wanted to share what we learned. And what we want to write a book is the book we would have liked to have had 30 years ago. Now we did, when or 25 years ago when we had our first kid, and we did, fairly well because we're both from educational backgrounds. When my parents were educators, Eva's parents are both professors, and so we grew up with that. But even then, we've learned so much over time. And what we've done in the book is we've listed all of these films, which are great films, all of these games, which are great games, because it really matters. Like there are some absolutely and there's so many wonderful books and games that have been created. So there's this one company called, I think it's called like Think Technology or something, and they've created these games, including one famous one called Traffic Jam that kids can play alone. That they're designed to develop your kids intellectually, right? And like all the way up through games like Bridge. And not all games are created equal. You don't want your kids playing War, which is a card game, a fairly mindless card game, when they're 10 years old, right? I mean, you can play a little bit, but you want to play games that challenge and develop them intellectually. So, in the book, we made a point of listing out, saying, these are the albums you should buy. These are the books you should listen to. These are the games you play. There's probably like, I don't know, 1,000 specific titles that we recommend, either books or games or movies, that frankly, for most adults, these are real finds. Like if you haven't, I don't know how much I watched, like High Noon, and Shane recently. Um, and I like it more than I did 20 years ago. I mean, I was like, oh, I can't believe I haven't watched it. So I don't know if people remember these old films. They're just so wonderful. So in any event, so the resources are are all in the book, and it's intended to be like a cookbook. There's like not a lot of theory in it, right? There's no studies. We're not trying to prove and tell you about these deep insights of these psychologists, right? It's more like this is what worked for us. This is what you can do with your kids.
That's really cool, man. Well, I want to make sure, as far as your website, where can men go to? I know to buy the book, it's on basically any bookstore possible, and it's also on
Yeah.
Amazon. Gentlemen, you're not going to have to look hard for Eric and his book. We'll have everything in the show notes for you. Head on over to thedadedge.com/Friday 135 for this show. Again, thedadedge.com/Friday 135 for this show. Eric, thank you so much for coming on today. This was awesome, a lot of fun, and I wish you the best, my friend. Thank you for sharing your expertise and also sharing some of the difficult questions I threw your way. I was just for years I've been curious about a lot of the things that I asked you today. So thanks for being able to bounce those back in a conversation format.
Sure. Thank you, Larry. It was a pleasure, and I wish everyone well in their parenting journey. The one
That's
thing I
right.
would just say for those of you who are more towards the beginning than towards the end, it can be frustrating, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I found each year got easier and more fulfilling. So
Awesome, man. Well, thank you for coming on, brother. I appreciate you.
sure.
All right, brother. Take care.